Hello, welcome back to The Art of the Book, our series of online tutorials on hand bookbinding. In this second chapter, we will be making a multi-section sewn journal, which follows on from our single section binding that we did in chapter 1. If you haven't already done so, check out chapter 1 because it covers all the basic principles of bookbinding, including grain direction and pagination. So in this exercise, we will be showing you how to fold a large sheet of paper into sections to form a sewn multi-section journal. It doesn't matter what size the sheet of paper is, paper sizes differ across the world, but it should be around 120 grams so that it can be easily folded. This exercise forms the first part of our City and Guilds Level 1 in hand bookbinding. For written instructions, follow the link on our website to The Art of the Book, where you will also find a comprehensive list of all the tools and materials you will need.
Welcome to Chapter 2 of The Art of the Book. Today we're going to make a multi-section binding. The important thing to bear in mind is that the grain direction is correct. I'm going to demonstrate using 4 SRA1 sheets of Munken Pure Rough 120 GSM. This will give us enough to have 8 8-leaf sections. To cut these sheets down, I'm going to first fold over, make sure they meet up, the corners meet up nicely, and taking my bone folder, giving a crease so that you've got a sharp crease. And I'm going to take the shoe knife, place it into the crease. So that's now 2 sheets. We're going to take one of the smaller sheets, fold it in half again, neatly, corner to corner, bone folder. Take the other sheet, same process, in half again. We now have 4 smaller sheets from the one large sheet. You can then take one of the smaller pieces, same principle, folding in half, creasing, and then we're just going to take it and fold it one last time. That gives us our page size. Take a second one of the smaller sheets, repeat the process, and then place those 2 folded sheets inside each other, and that gives us a section. Okay, so now that I've folded all of the sections, we're going to trim them. So I'm going to start with the open edge, and I'm going to use the grids on the mat to help me. So I'm going to find a horizontal line, line up the folded edge of the spine of the section, and allowing about 5 or 6 millimeters, about 1/4 of an inch overhang. I'm going to line up my safety ruler to one of the vertical lines, making sure it's nice and straight. And then with a sharp edge, I'm going to run that along the edge of the ruler, cutting off the excess, and then turning 90 degrees. Same principle, lining up your cut edge now against the horizontal, and lining up the ruler to the vertical, cutting off those few millimeters, and then the last edge, again lining up the spine, the folded edge of the section, and cutting off that last edge. And then you can repeat the process with all of the remaining sections, making sure they're all exactly the same size as each other. The next stage is we're going to mark up the holes for sewing. I'm using my engineer's square to make sure that my sections are neatly stacked on top of each other. I have also placed a weight on top, and with my pencil I'm marking the sewing positions. Starting at the tail, I mark the position of the lower kettle stitch, 20 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch from the bottom, and another at the head about 15 millimeters or 5/8 of an inch from the top. Then moving along the spine, I mark off the position of my 2 tapes, which are equidistant between the kettle stitches. Using my square, I'm now extending these pencil marks in straight lines down the width of the spine. I'm now going to repeat that process, this time using my awl to make a small indentation in the spine, which will act as a pilot hole when I come to sew the book. Bookbinder's thread comes in a variety of colours. I've chosen a red one today because it complements the colour scheme that I've chosen for my book. And also it will help when I come to demonstrate the stitching, it will stand out against the edge of the text block. To prepare your thread, we're going to do 8 sections, so I'm going to do it in 2 parts. So I'll have 4 lengths of the spine of the book. And I'm being quite generous with that, so 4 sort of generous lengths. Cut that off. And I'm also going to wax the thread, so I've got some beeswax here. And I'm just going to run the thread through the beeswax, just to give a little coating. And that helps to stop the thread from unravelling, and when we come to sew each section, it helps to kind of secure each section to the other. It kind of locks the thread in. After passing the thread through the eye of the needle, I twist the strands to open up a gap. Then pass the tip of the needle through the gap. I secure the thread by pulling it tight. This prevents a knot that could damage the paper. Now for the sewing. I've attached my 2 tapes with masking tape to the board to line up with my pencil lines. I now flip over all the sections apart from the first one and place a weight inside this section to keep it steady while I'm sewing. Using my needle, I go along the section, piercing a hole at each pencil mark. This should be relatively easy as I've already made indentations with the awl. Starting from outside the first kettle stitch, I push the needle through the first hole. Pulling in the direction of travel, I leave about 5 centimeters or 2 inches of thread, enough to tie a knot with, on the outside. I now work my way along the section, out the next hole, around the outside of the tape, and back into the section, always pulling the thread tight in the direction of travel. I bring the needle around the second tape, back into the section, and out of the last hole. I remove the weight, and using my bone folder, I'm rubbing down the section to help reduce the swell. I can now start on the next section by flipping it back over and laying it in position, matching up the pencil marks and making sure it's even head and tail. The weight goes back in to keep it steady, and I'm again using my needle to make the holes along the pencil lines. So I'm going in with my needle to the top hole, and then as before, coming along the section around the outside of the tapes and coming out of the kettle stitch. Make sure both threads are pulled tight before tying them together in a double knot. I now bring the third section over, lining up the pencil marks with the previous 2 sections, bring the weight into the middle of the section, Continue along the length of the section as before. At the far kettle stitch, pass the needle under the section below. This produces a loop. Pass the needle through this loop and pull tight to produce a knot. Now for the fourth section, I'm following exactly the same procedure. At this point, I'm running out of thread. So I bring over a new length of thread and start by making the beginnings of a knot. If I pull this tight, it will become a knot. I'm looping that around the length of the old thread and pulling it tight close to the inside of the section. Holding the old length of thread in one hand, still attached to the needle, and the new length of thread in the other, I'm tying a second knot and pulling that tight. I check that the knot is securely attached by pulling on the new long thread, and now that I'm happy that it's secure, I'm able to chop the thread off of the old threads, leaving about 1 centimetre to spare. I can now continue sewing, and finally, when I come to the last section, I finish off the sewing by creating 2 kettle stitches at the end. With the text block sewn, I've put a board and a weight on top. I'm going to apply my first layer of glue, going along the length of the spine, but not over the tapes. Rubbing in between the sections with my finger to make sure the adhesive is covering all of the sections fully. Now that the spine is dry, we can remove the boards ready for rounding the spine. So I'm just going to use my shoe knife to help just release the board. Okay, that's come off, and then it should just come off the bottom. Yeah. Okay. So we want there to be a bit of movement in the spine to allow for the rounding. So it's got a very slightly damp cloth, and I'm just going to run that across the glued edge to help reactivate the spine a little bit. So we're using a bookbinder's hammer, but a clean sort of household hammer would work as well. And I'm going to start, I've got the 4 edges facing me, and I'm going to put my thumb on the 4 edge just to help support it. And I'm sort of just drawing the first couple of sections towards me as much as I can. And then I'm going to accentuate that process with the hammer. So I'm just start to see a bit of movement, a bit of shape, and then you turn it round the other way and you do exactly the same from this side, persuading those first few sections to move in this direction, and that starts to just give a nice gentle rounded edge to the spine. Now that I've rounded the spine, I'm just going to apply another layer of glue to secure that shape. This time I'm actually going over the tapes as well, so we're gluing the full length of the spine this time. A good even coating of the adhesive all the way along, and again I'm going to use my finger to rub that in, making sure I'm getting all the way in between each of those sections. Now that the spine is dry, we can remove the boards. Excellent. And we can start applying our end papers. So we're going to apply by what is called tipping on, which is applying a small layer of glue to the front and the back pages and then attaching the end papers. Today we're going to use this lovely printed Italian decorative paper. I've made sure that the grain direction is correct, and they're slightly oversized, so they overhang a little bit on all the 3 edges. So I'm going to apply a bit of waste paper, and I'm leaving about 5 or 6 millimeters, about 1/4 of an inch, and getting some adhesive onto the brush and brushing away from the mask, which will give a precise line of glue that we can then use. So removing the waste paper, taking the folded edge of the decorative paper and just lining that up so that the fold sits right onto the fold of that top section. Rubbing that down and using my fingers. You can also use your bone folder so that's secure. And then we're going to trim the excess off. So to do that, we're going to turn it round, take the safety ruler, put that into the first section, and then line up the edge of the ruler so that it's in line with the edge of the pages. Taking a sharp knife, lining up to the ruler and cutting the excess off. Move it round, doing exactly the same on the foredge, right to the edge of the pages, and cutting that excess off, and then the last edge. And we now have an end paper that fits your text block exactly. Once you've done your first end paper, repeat the process exactly the same for the second end paper. After the end papers are on, we can apply our spine linings. So the first spine lining is some mull. So I'm going to glue up the spine the same as we have been previously, and this time again we're going to go along the whole length of the spine. A good even coating all the way along, and I've got a piece of mull that's about 1 millimetre shorter head and tail, and it's overhanging by about 20 millimetres, 3/4 of an inch, something like that, all the way on the front and the back. And I'm also going to use my bone folder, so getting that so that it's really solid on the spine. And we're going to apply our last spine lining, which is some craft paper. So I'll just give that another rub, just make sure I'm happy that it's secure. So reapplying some adhesive to the spine, going over the mull this time. Again, the whole length. And we want to cover the full width of the spine with craft lining. So I tend to have an oversized piece, so it's the same length as the text block. Again, I'm using my fingers, rubbing that in, and then can reinforce that with the bone folder. Giving it a rub from this side now. And then with this excess, I'm just going to fold that back over, creasing along the edge of the spine and cutting that excess off. And you can use your shoe knife, and then you now have a piece of craft covering the spine completely. One last little detail is to just taper off the mull just at a slight angle, and also just to trim the tapes so that they sit just inside the mull, and then the same on the other side. So the next thing is we're going to be making the case. So I've pre-cut 2 boards here, the front and the back. I'm using 2mm grey board for this exercise, and as we did for a single section in chapter 1, I've also allowed a 5mm square on the head, tail and the foredge. And the boards start about 6mm in, so about 1/4 of an inch in from the spine edge, which allows the boards to move. So I've got my 2 boards exactly the same size as each other, And we're also going to have a spine piece for this, just to give a bit of substance to the spine. In this case, we're going to use a Manila 225 GSM. To measure that, I'm going to use a scrap of paper to measure the distance around the spine. So popping that around the outside of the spine at the widest point, which is going to be one of your sewing stations where the tapes are. So taking your scrap of paper around the outside and with a sharp pencil marking the edge of the spine on both sides, and then we can measure the distance between those two, and then we're going to add 1 board thickness to that measurement. So in this case we're going to add 2 millimeters as well, and that will give us the exact width that we want our spine piece to be, and it will be the same height as the boards. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is just make a spacer or a gauge, just to determine how far the boards need to sit from each other when we come to make the case. So to do that, I'm going to take my first board, lay it down, and then lay the text block on, allowing that even square that we've worked out around the outside. Second board goes on top, lining up. And then you can have a bulldog clip just to help keep that into place. You need to remember to insert the spine piece as well, because that will make a difference as to how much space there is between the boards. And then with a scrap of paper, I'm going to pop that around the outside of the spine piece. And again, I'm going for the widest point, so around one of the sewing stations where you've got your tapes. And then with a pencil, mark the edge of the board at the spine edge on one side and the edge of the board on the spine edge on the other. So I can take that scrap of paper now and measure between those 2 marks, and that gives me the exact distance between the 2 boards. So I've cut my spacer to the measurement that we just worked out. I've positioned it in between the 2 boards and cut my cloth, leaving about 20 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch all the way around. I'm using a paper-backed rayon book cloth. It's paper-backed, which helps to stop there being any show through of the adhesive when we come to glue. What you can do as well is pop a pencil mark around the outside of the boards to help us to come to position. And it's worth just putting a ruler at the bottom to make sure that they're lined up with each other, so it's going to be flush at the bottom. And you can pencil line all the way around, and that just gives you a visual marker when we come to glue. The next process is gluing or pasting out the cloth. Today I'm going to be using Shepherd's Binders paste, which is a 50-50 mix of PVA and paste. That element of the paste allows there to be more open time or gluing time. So we're going to be gluing a rather sort of larger piece of material, and it just allows that time for it to not dry out too quickly. I've decanted that paste PVA mix into a roller and tray. This gives you a good even coverage when you're coming to glue. You could also use a paste brush. I recommend a paste brush with quite a big head if you're going to do a largish area. I've got some waste paper underneath as well, I'm just happy that my boards are sitting in their pencil line, so we can remove those for now because we've got the marks where they're going to sit. Okay. So starting from the middle, you're going to roller out the full size of the cloth. And remove any lumps or bumps if you see them there. Okay. And then we're going to get the waste paper out of the way, so that you're working on a nice clean bench. The first board goes into place, into those pencil lines. Give it a good rub down. Spacer goes in. Don't rub that down, that's just as a gauge. And then the second board in place, making sure you're in those pencil lines so that it's even at the bottom there. Give that a rub down. Spacer can come out. Spine piece goes in, and that goes in equidistant between the two boards, so there will be a little gap either side. And give that a rub down. You can turn it all over and give a rub from this side. Careful not to stick your edges to the bench, just focusing on the boards and the spine piece. Okay. Then you can turn that over. We're going to trim our corners now. So cutting at 45-degree angle and allowing a board or two board thicknesses away from the edge of the board where you make your cut. Get those out of the way because they'll be sticky. And then with your bone folder, bringing up your turn-in tight against the edge of the board. Tweak those corners in to a slight taper, second long edge. And I'm really pushing down into the spine area as well. Again, tweaking those corners. And then the last edges. If you do find that your glue is drying out when you come to do your last turn in, you can always freshen that up. Get a clean bit of waste paper, and with a brush you can just apply another bit onto the turn-in just to help. Waste paper out of the way, and then we have the case. We're going to trim out the turn-ins because what you might find is that the gluing process has stretched or warped them slightly, and we'd like our turn-ins to be as neat as possible because we'll see a slight shadow of them underneath the end papers. So what I'm doing here is with a pair of dividers is I'm just scoring a line into the cloth so that I can see where I need to position my ruler. And I've set them at about 15 millimeters, about 5/8 of an inch. So that's just about 5 millimeters or so in from the original turn-in. And then with a safety ruler, I can line that up against the line that I've just made. And then with a sharp knife, I'm just slicing. And we're going to go around all of the edges, lining up to that line. And we need to be careful not to cut through the spine, so you're only cutting off the excess cloth from the boards. So stop when you get to the edge of the board. With the tip of the knife, you can lift the bit that you've just cut and peel it off. We've got a nice even turn in all the way around. One last thing is we can just persuade the spine of the case to have a gentle curve so that it matches the curve on the text block. So we have our two components. We have the text block and the case ready, so now we can join them to complete the binding. I'm taking the text block and positioning it onto the case, allowing that even square on those three edges that we worked out earlier. And I'm going to take some waste paper, pop it in between the two coloured leaves, and using the binder's paste, the paste PVA mix again, I'm going to load up my brush and lifting the mull and the tapes out of the way, a bit of the adhesive underneath the tapes, underneath the mull, and then on top of the tapes, on top of the mull, and then on the rest of the end paper, working from the middle out. Making sure I've covered all of the end paper. Waste paper comes out, holding the text block in place and bringing the case up to meet the spine and gently closing onto the end paper. Put a 90-degree angle. This gives you the opportunity to be able to just position your end paper, make sure you're happy with that square. And I'm holding it up this way just to stop any kind of stretching in the end paper joint area here. When you're happy that it's in the right place, give it a nice rub down. You can use your hands and your folder, and then closing the binding, rubbing from the outside into that joint area. Okay. Then we can do the same process on the other side, so it's already where we want it to sit. Clean piece of waste paper in between the two coloured leaves, more adhesive, and underneath the tapes, on top of the tapes, on top of the mull. Waste paper out of the way, case up towards the spine, gently closing, and again you can just tweak the positioning. When you're happy that it's sitting with an even square, give it a rub down gently in that spine area. Close and rub from the other side into that joint area. Okay, now that I'm happy that that's all in place, I'm going to take blotting paper, pop it between the coloured end papers, and then position the book between two weights, and I'm letting the spine protrude, but making sure that the boards, the pressing boards, are covering the boards of the book, and popping that under a weight and letting that dry overnight so it should settle nice and flat. So the book has dried overnight, and we can remove the weight, remove the boards, and we can also remove the blotting paper, so that should come out. And we now have our finished journal with our lovely end paper on the inside. So that completes chapter 2 of The Art of the Book. I hope you have enjoyed the process and are ready to make your own multi-section bindings.
Hi Mylan.
Hey Ali.
Oh, that looks great. Oh, it's lovely what you can achieve with a few sheets of paper and some basic tools and materials. I love the red thread and the cloth and the paper combination. It's fantastic. And the rounded spine makes such a difference, I think.
I agree.
So what's up next?
Well, I was going to do Japanese stab binding, so it's a little bit different, but it's one that's been really popular with my students over the years.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it. See you in chapter 3. For more information on tools and materials, please follow the link to The Art of the Book on our website.